in this first panel, we're particularly looking at how different medieval cultures interacted with power and how we see that power through games. In particular, I wanted this panel to focus a bit on thinking about the medieval world outside its sort of most classic Western proto-state imaginary. So thinking about cultures with much more imperial concepts of power, or cultures that didn't have the sort of sedentary cultural roots in the same way, or with different systems of control compared to what we'd imagine in a more Western Middle Ages. And how those cultures relate to games and to sort of modern ideals and imaginaries of nation states and so on can be quite different to what we might imagine for a medieval France or a medieval England. And with me today, I have some people working around these areas. Whilst you have heard their introductions of themselves, I will also introduce them for the panel, particularly as that will get it onto the recording, which Jaffet is currently doing. With me, I have Maria Vrij, the coin curator at the Barber Institute in Birmingham and a specialist on Byzantine coinage. She has a keen interest in how the public relates to Byzantine history, both through active work on Byzantine history and coinage, and museum-related work, and through an interest in games. Her work on game cultures, in particular, has explored the ways in which Byzantium has received renewed public interest through games like Crusader Kings 3, and thinking about its dual role as Christian empire and Roman post-Roman state, and how that creates complex interactions with understandings of European and Christian and other forms of modern identity. Fionnuala Fisk, or Finn, is a tabletop role-playing game master and is the founder of an indie art and game studio focused on social good, which is called Swan and Raven Studio. She's based in Vienna, Austria, and she runs a game master supergroup for people running and designing tabletop role-playing games in the area. And her current projects include the early development stages of a prehistoric focused strategy game and a tabletop game project with a setting based on the Mongol Empire. Right. I think that we Still do not seem to have Stefan in the room, so I will introduce Stefan as and when he appears. I don't think it hugely matters which order of people we go in, but Maria, would you be up for going first? So each, to give the format notes, each panelist is going to give you a brief introduction over the course of 10 minutes or so to what they do, and then we'll open the floor to more open discussion and questions around the topic. So yeah, Maria, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's perhaps sort of worth saying that a lot of the games and my experience with games that I'm going to be discussing come from the perspective of somebody who is very much based in the UK. But one of the things that I'm sort of more broadly interested in thinking about and talking about as well is the ways in which changing and expanding game markets in other parts of the world might impact the way in which different historical states are represented, for both better and worse. So in the world of Byzantium, that's particularly the Turkish market, is a question, but I know also for people working on other parts of the world, the expansion into the Chinese gamer market is another aspect worth looking at. I'd like to sort of begin by just making some general remarks about the evolution of the depiction of the Byzantine Empire in sort of games and gaming. And then look a little bit more specifically at the way the Byzantine state has been structured for the very recent Roads to Power DLC for Crusader Kings 3, which, in my view, represents a sort of marked departure from some of the past tropes that have existed. Ironically, I think a lot of it also returns to some much older tropes within academia, and its subsequent reception by players. So if you do a basic search on Steam for games that include Byzantium or the Byzantines, almost all of them are going to be 4X or grand strategy games. Where Byzantium tends to appear in sort of first-person sims or hack and slash, they're usually there as sort of the other. So, for example, Land of the Magnates, which is Persian-focused, or Osman Gazi, which, as the name suggests, is more Turkish-focused. Byzantium seems to me, and again, anybody has any examples of where this isn't the case, please do let me know. It doesn't seem to be replicated in any games where the goal is to sort of live out your best Byzantine life. They're typically focused on broader historical narratives where Byzantium is either the vehicle or it's an obstacle. Of course, relative to representations of Central Asia and the Mongols, it would make me sound like a complete fraud to complain about Byzantium being othered, when Byzantium has been a consistently playable faction in video games such as Age of Empires, Total War, Civilization, Crusader Kings, Europa Universalis, etc. While the Mongols in particular have tended to be introduced as an NPC faction just to pose a challenge to the player, and they're often simply represented as what players might term as death stacks, or mindless hordes of large numbers bent on destruction of yours, your enemies, and your allies' holdings for reasons. There is an extent to which Byzantium is still othered, to an extent. As I say, they're almost always the vehicle for a particular grand historical narrative that the player wants to create, rather than being the end goal in themselves. So to play as Byzantine, it's usually wrapped up in things like restoring the Roman Empire or sort of stopping the rise of the Ottomans, something like that. There are a few depictions of Byzantium in tabletop games that I've found. There aren't very many, but ones like, for example, this, which we noted, I don't know if you can see that from the camera, Last Days of Constantinople, which is sort of a guide for a tabletop role-playing game where the player group are largely Catholic coded emissaries of the Pope going to Byzantium and experiencing Byzantium as outsiders, and that's sort of for where Byzantium is represented there. That seems to me at least to be a bit more typical. You're experiencing it as an outsider rather than living as or being Byzantine yourself. That said, Byzantium does seem to be an incredibly popular sort of polity for people to play as. When I was an undergraduate, back between 2007 and 2010, I met a lot of students who'd taken Byzantine modules because they played Medieval 2 Total War, for example. And now when I have students come to me, a lot of them will have ideas about what Byzantium is based on games that they might have played, as well as the popularity of sort of books that are now more readily available in general bookshops, where they weren't necessarily earlier on. It's also interesting to see how Byzantium is represented in the modding space as well. So if you take a game like Stellaris, which is based in sort of space, it's a futuristic game, there are mods if you want to live out your best life as the space empire of Trebizond, for example. You can do that. So there's space being created by players as well. I think one of the reasons that Byzantium is so popular, apparently to the surprise of some developers in terms of the statements that they put out, I think it's because Byzantium can act as a vehicle for certain alternative history fantasies that players might have. So typically it will be based around the idea of restoring the Roman Empire. This often comes with sort of idea of restoring the pre-Christian, usually Greek rather than Roman pantheon, which seems to be particularly popular again. Things like mods for Europa Universalis will allow you to play as the Hellenism following Romans starting in North America for reasons of alternative history. And Byzantium could sort of sometimes be used to function as that. There's an increasing move towards the idea of having sort of orthodox domination of the game, which is more centered around the idea of subordinating Catholicism to orthodoxy and returning to the true united church, as players might see it. And that seems to be sort of increasing in popularity. There's also the sort of anti-Islam, anti-Turkish in particular, bent of trying to stop the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Although it's also worth saying that Byzantium can pose some interesting gamer challenges. So you would usually start in the middle of a map. It's very rare that Byzantium will be at the edge of a map, despite being often peripheral. So it usually has those sort of inherent challenges. It will usually have ideas about it that can be quite antiquated. So, for example, in Attila Total War, which represents a much earlier example of Byzantium, the more you research technology, the more you degrade effectively, which is an interesting concept. And the question of time is also one that can be difficult when it comes to representing Byzantium and the Byzantine world. So when in Byzantium exactly is being meant? Is it the age of Constantine in the 4th century? Is it sort of the age of Theodosius and the sort of the twilight of antiquity in inverted commas? Is it the age of Heraclius and the rise of Islam? It almost never means something like the age of iconomachy, which is my specialism. So just thought I'd get that little grumble in. It very rarely means the era of conversions of the various different Slavic peoples. It almost always means the Comnenian era as contemporaries to the Crusades, and occasionally it might mean the sort of the Paleologan era and the end of the empire. So there's a huge amount of change of state structures that takes place over that period of time. But the sort of combining of when exactly are you representing in Byzantium and the player's fantasies means that you often end up with the Byzantines looking very anachronistically Roman. So specifically taking ideas of classical Rome and then embedding that into what being Byzantine looks like. And that's not just a gamer thing, and it's also not just an Anglophone thing. So, for example, there's a Turkish film, 1453, where you have Constantine the 11th living in what I can only describe as a Baroque era Western European palace, surrounded by stereotypical scantily clad Eastern European women who are serving him and his betogered courtiers. He then goes out and looks onto what I can only describe as second century Rome. It's quite a weird hodgepodge of images, and so it's not sort of just from a gaming perspective or from an Anglo-centric perspective that you will see that sort of strange melding in representation. Sometimes that can mean that you get sort of an overbearing. Actually, let's not have that point there. So actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to quickly skip forward to talk specifically about examples such as I briefly mentioned Total War Attila and its predecessor, which is the barbarian invasion expansion for Rome, Total War. They're sort of a couple of the exceptions to the rule where Byzantium usually means the Komnenian period. That's actually looking more towards the 5th century. There isn't very much to be said on the state structures that are represented in the sort of the main base games for these. They play very much like any other non-nomadic faction, but with a particular East Roman flavour. But as I've briefly mentioned, the tech tree is conforming to this much older 1960s scholarship idea of sort of regression. So as you research in the tech tree, you actually lose things that you could previously build. So as you develop more, you go backwards effectively. And that sort of relationship to the way that Byzantium is presented to modern scholarship is something I'll briefly mention again in a second, because I also realize I'm nearly running close to my 15 minutes. Also worth saying that these games seem to particularly bill themselves as, yes, this is looking at the Huns and Attila, but actually in the way that the game is put together, it seems to be that it's more targeted at playing as the Eastern or Western Roman empires. Playing as the Sasanians in this game, for example, is extraordinarily boring as an experience as a player. But it's trying to sell itself on the excitement of that period of the Huns appearing and the challenge that poses for the empire. And it's very much from the empire's perspective that this is done. Finally, just very, very briefly, you've got Paradox Interactive have released a very Byzantine-focused DLC, Roads to Power, for their game Crusader Kings 3. So this, I know, has been done in conjunction with a scholar called Anthony Caldelis, and sort of having read some of his work, you can see his fingerprints all over this. It really updates the way that the game works, which is originally fundamentally built on the idea of the way that Western feudal states worked, and it updates it so that you now have you invest some of your political capital into trying to get your particular preferred candidates into particular imperial positions. So you don't inherit land as such, you inherit your family's estate. But there are problems inherent in the way that this works. So for example, if you're looking at 11th century Byzantium, that's a great model and it works brilliantly. If you're looking at 867, which is the earliest start date in the game, do you really have great families as such? Not really, but you also need the game structure to be there to exist, to facilitate the development of these great families. So they have to be there. There are also other structures like co-emperorship, which seem to be entirely designed around what happens in the 10th century with the career of the Emperor Romanus I Lecapenus, taking over as a regent for the Emperor Constantine VII, and then slowly trying to take power away from Constantine and make himself the emperor with his own son, Christopher, as emperor. He gets overthrown. It doesn't quite work out for him. But the way that those systems are designed within the game seems specifically there to be able to replicate this thing that happened. Is that relevant to the later period? No. But that's part of the other difficult question around how do you do historical games. People will want to be able to replicate things that literally happened in history. They feel like games should be able to replicate that, but they also want enough of a sandbox to be able to impose their own will on the game, and so it's part of that struggle. There are also things that come across from the fact that Caldelis in particular is heavily involved in this. So the way that Byzantine multiculturalism is represented, or rather not represented, it follows the basic lines that the Western European states will do. So you'll have random Jewish courtiers will turn up at some point. There's no real sense that you have a lot of Armenians or Georgians, people of different faiths. So you will have Muslims as well who are integrated into particularly the Constantinopolitan world. That doesn't really come across. And I bring up the sort of whose scholarship are they following, specifically because this particular academic has an entire chapter in one of his books called The Armenian Fallacy, which, if I can paraphrase the sort of opening to that, it's basically, oh, I'm not anti-Armenian, I have lots of Armenian friends, but they weren't important and didn't exist in the Byzantine Empire. Why does everybody think I'm a Greek nationalist? So there are sort of ways in which the multiculturalism of Byzantium is swayed in favor of that particular academic perspective. There's also very little done with the role of the patriarch. So weirdly, in contrast to other games, which will be very overbearingly orthodox in trying to appeal to the pro-orthodox crowd of gamers, you don't see much of that in this particular DLC. And then you also see the issue of ideas about Byzantium which are grounded in something, for example, the importance of eunuchs at the imperial court, which then ends up with half of your entire world being castrated when they're sort of younger as beardless eunuchs to be sent off to the court, which is sort of very strange when you're then looking at half of your grandchildren have been castrated and they can't continue the line because the idea is that they're supposed to be sent onto the court. Or, for example, the number of people who turn up with gold noses. It's something that happened once in Byzantium, but this gets sort of over replicated, which in turn then ties back into those much older tropes rather than Byzantium as specifically Roman coded, Byzantium as everybody is, or the over importance and over representation of eunuchs in particular, and then strange, cruel and unusual punishments like cutting off the nose and it being replaced by a gold one. So even though this particular DLC does make Byzantium much more Byzantine, much more obviously Byzantine as opposed to Roman but medieval, it sort of weirdly ties back into some of these older tropes, which isn't necessarily an issue, but it's almost creating these Byzantinisms afresh, rather than having the sort of Romanisms in a medieval setting. Anyway, I've massively overrun my time. I'm very sorry, so I'm going to hand over to somebody else now.
Thank you. Right, so I've have unfortunately received word from Stefan that he's feeling unwell and is not going to be able to make it. So that then leaves Finn as our second speaker. Finn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Maria, as well, for your presentation. So I want to move things away from 4X video games to the tabletop world. I want to talk a little bit about tabletop role-playing games first, just give a very brief introduction to what they are in case anyone here is not super familiar with them, and then get into power in culture and tabletops. So, why tabletop role-playing games? They're the precursors to video games. They are hopefully very inspirational for anyone here who is a video game developer. Disco Elysium started as a tabletop role-playing setting, so if that tells you anything, I learned this fact yesterday. Shout out to the workshop yesterday. So that should tell you about the quality of and the richness of world building within tabletop role-playing games. Also, it's what I know. I have my little studio these days, but I come from a tabletop world, so I would talk more about it now while on stage than I would about video game development. So what is a tabletop role-playing game? It's a collaborative storytelling game. They're frequently multiplayer with players role-playing as particular characters. Usually there is a storyteller or a dungeon master, a DM, narrating, having a level of narrative authority over the world, and usually using dice to resolve uncertainty. There are, of course, exceptions to all of these, but when you're thinking about, for example, Dungeons & Dragons, the largest of the tabletop role-playing games, those would be norms that all apply in that situation. At the end, I will provide a list of games into the chat, so keep your eye out for that. I'm going to be mentioning a few during this. Most of these tabletop role-playing games are medieval fantasy, drawing, of course, from Tolkien. I will be kind of centralizing medieval Europe a little bit in this talk. Most of the time, I don't at all center it in the work that I do, mostly because I'm undoing as much as I can Eurocentrism within the fantasy worlds that I'm creating. What is medieval about this fantasy that we see in games like Dungeons & Dragons? We've got the technology level. So we're not talking about gunpowder being used in guns so frequently. We're not talking as frequently about the steam engine or anything of that nature. Usually when we're looking at medieval fantasy, we're pre-steam engine and pre-guns. That can differ, of course. We've got the existence of aristocracy and the aesthetics of the social structure of feudalism. There's an interesting blog post by Richard Grenville about why medieval fantasy is not actually feudalism. It's more of a sort of colonial era social structure with the aesthetics of feudalism, but we have dukes and we have a built environment as well that reflects medievalisms. So frequently this medieval fantasy has castles, has villagers, inns, things of that nature. And you also see folklore-inspired fantastical elements of magic and monster. These games do draw inspiration from outside of just medieval Europe, but for example, the dragon in Dungeons & Dragons would have origins within folklore. The biggest of these medieval fantasy games would be Dungeons & Dragons. There are multiple settings that are published by the Dungeons & Dragons Wizards of the Coast. Yeah, they publish Greyhawk, and they publish a few others as well, but Forgotten Realms is the primary one that they are publishing under. You may have interacted with this world if you've ever played Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 is, in general, quite a good video game representation of the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. I don't ever really play Forgotten Realms, that setting, or the other published settings. I run my own stuff, so I don't have a lot to say on it. But that's sort of the generic archetype, I guess one might say, that a lot of players are working with, is this sort of pseudo-medieval fantastical setting. There are a variety of other games that interact in some way or another with medievalisms, as well as plenty of games that are working with completely different cultural backgrounds. Just to name one or two, both for Dungeons and Dragons and also for other systems. We have a setting published for Dungeons and Dragons called the Wagadu Chronicles. That's inspired by African folklore. We have Raven and Crow, which is a tabletop role-playing game based on Native American cultures, sort of utopian-ish world where the colonial encounter never happened. There is a whole community of tabletop role-playing games published by Southeast Asian authors, and the community is called SEA RPG, so like Southeast Asia RPG. So they're producing a lot of very interesting things at the moment. That's more in the indie space. So there's a whole world out there. There's a lot of really interesting games, supplements for Dungeons and Dragons, and worlds in the indie and non-indie spaces. To talk about political power in tabletop role-playing games, power is represented in obviously differently in different games. In Dungeons and Dragons, which again is the biggest of the games, it's well over 50% of the market of what's being played at the moment. Power is usually represented through, in Dungeons and Dragons, it's represented through a level of prowess, which is sort of magical or martial might, especially as seen in combat. Agency, which is how the players can interact with the world. There's a whole, topic there you could dig into about whether games are providing narrative agency more to players, more to a GM. There's a lot of GM-less games where players are co-creating a world together and co-creating a story together. And within Dungeons and Dragons, you can have a very railroaded story where the DM is, carefully guiding the players through a pre-written adventure or storyline versus the more open world of, for example, the OSR games, the old school Renaissance games where players are just sort of set free into a sandbox and told to go do something. So we've got prowess, we've got agency, and we've got prestige. Prestige in Dungeons and Dragons is not codified out through mechanics. It's more of a reward. So you can imagine the prototypical group of players or adventurers who beat the dragon and win a castle and ensuing accoutrement. Prowess, the first one I mentioned, is most often made visible through levels. So, for example, once you hit level 10, you are more powerful than you were at level 2. You can cast grander spells or kill people faster. And prowess is power through the threat of physical force. For example, there's often the situation where the players wander into the royal court and the big bad king is telling them to kneel, and the players who have not fully bought into the power of this king say, well, what are you going to do? You going to kill me? Because we're level 10 and we don't care about you. You sort of can run into that situation as a DM where you're not certain how to fully inflict in-game or narrative power on these players because they have gained enough, their levels are high enough, their prowess is enough that they feel quite confident in their abilities. Settings where issues of power most frequently come up would be court intrigue games. For example, Court of Blades is a game specifically set in a royal court where you play as, courtiers for specific houses, powerful houses. I mentioned already Dungeons & Dragons games where players gain prestige as a reward for their heroic exploits. There are also horror games that explore issues of powerlessness, both powerlessness against monstrosity and powerlessness within a social context, and indie games that explore interpersonal conflict in particular. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of that a bit later on. You can model power through both setting and narrative and or mechanics. So for example, Dungeons & Dragons doesn't have much in its rule set other than what I've already talked about through the levels and the sort of the prowess to represent broader issues of power. A game that does would be something like Blades in the Dark. So Blades in the Dark has rules about factions where there is a list of, 30 factions or so. Each faction has a tier between 1 and 4. And the players in this game go on heists, and as they succeed or fail in their heists, their own faction and the factions of the world around them change in tier rank. So the higher the tier, the more powerful they are, and it gives them access to different assets. They can sort of upgrade their faction as they go. And this is quite frequently a situation in role-playing games, especially those sort of in some way influenced by Dungeons & Dragons, where sometimes games say that they're about politics, but they don't really have mechanics that support politicking. So Dungeons & Dragons comes from war games, and you can see that very much in the rule set. There's sort of 2 modes of play in Dungeons & Dragons. There's combat, and then there's everything else. There's like regular role-playing. So combat has a lot of rules. This part of it is you know when your turn is, you know what exactly you can do, you have information about what exactly, what is the radius of your spell, who does it damage, what damage does it do. That's all written down in the book. Versus when you're in a social situation, yes, you might have to roll to see how charismatic you are, how persuasive you were in that one moment, but there's not all of the sort of in-game infrastructure the way there is for the combat. So is that because of the wargame roots? Is it because you can more sophisticatedly model social complexities in your own head? For example, Brennan Lee Mulligan, who's quite a well-known D&D GM, has said that people have asked him, why do you only play D&D? Have you not considered playing other systems? There's plenty out there. And he has said that he needs rules for modeling combat, but he doesn't need rules for modeling social interactions. He can do that in his own head. He is not a master of hand-to-hand combat, so he needs that level of abstraction for it. He doesn't need that abstraction. He can just sort of describe what's going on and role play out as the non-player characters. Regardless, you end up in situations where there's games such as Vampire the Masquerade, which is a vampire-themed game. The rules say that, or the description at the beginning says that it's about politics, but when you actually look at the description of what the rules are about, nearly all of it is about combat.
Finn, could you wrap up in the next minute or so we still have some question time?
Yes, I will skip over some of this. Yep. I want to talk a little bit about how power can be modeled or expressed in indie games. So stepping outside of that sort of big, how is it normally done? I want to talk quickly about 3 games. So I'll just quickly say there's an indie game called Potvory, which is about an early medieval Slavic town, 9th century town, where players play as monsters of Slavic folklore, navigating a changing world where Christianity comes to power. So the game provides a meta currency representing the corporality of the of the monsters. So as the game continues, they can gain and lose influence points, representing paganism's influence in the town versus Christianity. So as Christianity gains power, the players lose corporality and vice versa. So you can sort of represent power through a meta currency. There's also Blood Feud, which is a game about toxic masculinity set in pre-Christian Viking Scandinavia. So not quite medieval, but close enough that I figured I'd mention it. So it's GM-less. Power is codified through honor points. So players grant honor points to other players through moves. So if you, as a character, comment on a woman's appearance, you can be granted an honor point by another player. If you sleep with a man you look down upon, you can be granted an honor point, or you win an honor point. It's semi-competitive, so there is no one winner, but you are explicitly creating a social hierarchy within the game. So that's one way of modeling power. And then there's another game that I want to talk about briefly called The Emperor and the Explorer. So it's a two-person game about Marco Polo and Kublai Khan, or the Emperor and the Explorer. You playing with objects. So you collect 10 to 15 interesting objects. The explorer hands an object to the emperor. The emperor sort of makes a guess about what city or what land the object came from within his own realm. It's also based on Invisible Cities, if you've read that book. And then the explorer has to correct the emperor in a way that does not offend the emperor. And you go through the objects, and at the end, the emperor offers reward or punishment based on how those corrections went. So it very explicitly is a game about power imbalance, and yeah. I have some thoughts as well about how I'm modeling power in my own games, but I would very happily stop here, and we could definitely talk about it more at some other point.
Great. Yes, I mean, we will have time throughout the weekend to talk about many more of these aspects. It's the advantage of going first on the panel's front. I think since we started a little late, I would quite like it if we could run this session to maybe 5 past rather than on the hour, if that's okay with people. And to make sure people get time for their questions, I'd like to immediately open the